What's cooler than being cool? Joining us on Cool People, Cool Tech, Cool Stories, the podcast that explores the intersections between inspiring technology, fascinating people, and captivating stories, or a combination of all three. So today, get ready to embrace your inner cool kids as we go behind the scenes. Today's innovators and storytellers, I'm your host, Cameron Kitt, CEO and founder of Yo-Yo's, You Own Your Own Stories, a documentary storytelling company. And today I'm talking with Gloria Bouillon, a distinguished aviation strategist and advisor with lots of accolades under her belt. She's a key figure in the advanced air mobility space, CEO and founder of Aviatris Advisors, and does many more things that we'll talk about today. But Gloria, thanks for coming on.
Thanks so much for inviting me. I'm really glad our paths crossed.
Yeah, I can't, when you're interested in advanced air mobility, I think it's inevitable that the paths will cross with you because you've been really driving it forward. And I think we share a lot of interest in just changing the way that people move around. And your background in aviation, I think, is just so fascinating. So I think it was inevitable to have you come on. So I'm going to start with your origin story. What was the thing that got you into flying? What was that kind of inciting incident?
Oh, it's interesting. So my father moved here from France, and I remember from very young, probably 6 or 7 years old, that's when my parents said that I started telling them that I was going to fly them to France. And so I had just always had that innate desire, I guess. And from a very young age, I just knew that I was going to start flying. And so um, I, uh, it came very naturally to me. And so when I was 13, I actually took my first flight. And from there, I remember grabbing the controls, and actually the pilot that allowed me to go up. We went around the area, and the second, we were airborne, I was just like, this is it. There's nothing else that I want to do other than fly.
Yeah, like your soul was shining and content.
It was.
That's such a cool story. I mean, I love that it was just like within you, and so you as an adorable 6-year-old were like, "Mama, Papa, I'm going to fly you to France," and they would just like laugh at this.
Yeah.
So I guess they were talking about wanting to go home or something, and you were thinking,
As a
yeah,
family, we flew to France often, and
uh-huh.
so I remember just thinking, oh, I'm going to land in my grandma's driveway. That's how I'm going to get us there. And it was just
Cute. Well, now you can think
I
about that.
know.
That's so crazy, full circle for little 6-year-old Gloria.
Yeah.
Um, Wow, that's so great. So your parents allowed you to get in a small airplane that the pilot kind of let you start doing
Well,
like flying lessons?
it's interesting actually. It kind of came full circle. When I bought my first plane years ago, actually, I had always had that as a goal. And I think it was Father's Day of, maybe 5 or 6 years ago or so. And I actually flew back to that same little grassfield airport. And when I landed, of course, my dad had his iPad out. He's filming me on his iPad.
As dads do.
Yep, as dads do. And I picked him up, and we flew out of that same airport. And that same plane that I had my first flight in was still there. Of course, it's definitely not in airworthy condition. It was, there's grass growing up from under it, but that same plane was still there.
Hmm.
Yeah, so it was just a really incredible moment that it kind of came full circle to pick my dad up in my plane and then fly the same area and route. And of course, I gave him controls, and we flew over a house and everywhere else. So
This is the power of manifestation, is when you make a
exactly.
declaration from a young age. So wait, the difference between then, since this was fairly recently or a few years ago?
No,
That you picked.
this is probably 5 or 6 years ago.
Okay.
Yeah, and I do the similar flights with him sometimes. But it was just the moment of seeing that same plane there, and I'm sure it's still there, just sitting there in the grass.
People like you are very lucky to have that "this is it" moment. A lot of people kind of go around and try and flip flop and ping pong between different careers. So you've actually had a blessing that it's very clear what you're going to be doing your whole life is something to do with flight. right?
Yeah, I do feel fortunate in that regard. And so we grew up on a farm, and we were always involved in the equipment. And,
Mm.
one of the things my dad wanted me to do is first thing is teach all of us how to do an oil change. And, so we're driving farm equipment. And so that's what I grew up with. I just, being around engines and types of equipment from a very young age. It came kind of naturally, I guess. So when you're actually looking at like aircraft systems and everything, I just already had a innate not ability, but just an understanding of how things operate and why they operate. So I think it was probably part of my background, just growing up being curious about how things work because we had to do that as
Yeah,
part of growing up on a farm.
it makes sense. You were comfortable with machinery.
Yeah. Mhm.
And yeah, you kind of have like an engineering mindset. So
Mhm.
I want to get more into your own, your own plane, your own personal flying and your work. But
Mhm.
tell me just if you could explain to the audience, what is advanced air mobility? What is AAM?
Yeah, sure. So advanced air mobility, it really started taking off back in 2010s era, where, you had some Uber Elevate and some other companies and some individuals really kind of focusing in on that, honing in on what the foundations would be. And so it's really all encompassing right now. When I, we're going to talk about mostly, I would say, eVTOLs, which are electric vertical takeoff and landing. There's also different types. So eCTOLs, which are conventional takeoff and landing, which would require more space when you're looking at the propulsion systems, what kind of space and engines they have, or systems that are basically propulsion systems to advance forward and movement. And then there's ESTOLs. There's a whole bunch of different types, but for just to keep it more about what we're talking about for AAM, Advanced Air Mobility, we're going to be talking about eVTOLs because that involves mostly electric aircraft. Where right now there's also hydrogen, hybrid,
Hmm.
different types of variants that are on the market that are either a lot of startups are focusing on, so not exactly in production, but some prototypes are being
Yeah.
developed. And really, and it's more than just the eVTOLs, the aircraft, the vehicles themselves. It's excuse me, it's really all encompassing as far as the air traffic management, the flow, the airports or vertiports in which the eVTOLs would land and operate on, either independently or on an airport system in a designated area
Yeah.
itself, that would potentially be separated from other traffic or managed with the operations itself. So
Yeah.
it's really all encompassing as to the what it takes for the groundwork with the infrastructure on the airports or vertiports itself, off the airports, and then the air traffic management systems, and then the urban air mobility, regional air
Yes.
mobility. So
So it's a lot of,
lots
so
of
here's, for the people that work on it, it's a bunch of acronyms. And for
yes,
the public, the acronyms just wash over them. For the public,
yes.
they see the flying cars. And I know they're
Mhm.
not flying cars, but the public calls them flying cars, flying vehicles. That's what they
Yes.
see, the sexy thing. And advanced air mobility, what my friend Gary Geisen calls future mobility, is that whole landscape of interwoven. There's drones, there's, I think this idea of the sustainability of this new approach to transportation and connecting cities and people faster is what really intrigues me. But it's the whole connected web that we're building on what already exists and also building new platforms and places, right? So some of them will be
Absolutely.
attached to airports. Thank you. I've I've been working on it,
Yeah.
but it's like the public, a lot of people, it's like there's a big difference between people who work in it and the public's understanding, right? There's like aviation fanatics who are kind of aware, but I think on the broad scale, most people in the US have no
Mhm.
idea what this is or that it even exists.
Yeah, it's interesting because the target on, I shouldn't say the target, but the a lot of the goals of advanced air mobility, AAM, is for sustainability, greener, sustainable uses of power, so energy sources. So whether it's solar, turbine, and making use of those to support the ground infrastructure. You mentioned drones, autonomous flights. So how it can be integrated into the system. So have the a major goal is accessibility. So how to make customers, consumers who may not potentially be particular customers in, so let's say, for example, it's a private airport, general aviation traffic, no airlines, which are, in my opinion, and I would say some others, are the perfect area to start operations, because they're sometimes in suburban areas, and these potential users may not be using the system. So the goal would be the long term is more accessibility for interconnectivity. So flying into regions or areas that may not be as accessible, so mountainous areas. Islands are a perfect example for these operations. And of course, doing it in a much more, I would say, innovative way that really kind of has the industry looking at it as a whole of how are we going to change, manage this, support the companies that are really um, moving the needle in this, and extremely innovative solutions that I'm sure you're aware of the companies and what they're doing. But for the public, it's going to be a lot of education, much like any type of airport development or project, because these are newer systems. So where you have public that would be normally used to how you go through security lines at the airport, you have a very customer centric type of view on how airport operations typically go. When you get onto your flight, you go through security, you move through the airport in the system. The advanced air mobility of using a vertiport, if that's the case, where you have a multimodal scenario with either bus transport or other means of public transportation that are also towards using electric mobility, seamless mobility, autonomous systems, again, looking at apps. So really a seamless transition for the passenger. So the passenger experience, looking at that being quite different from what we have right now.
Yeah, and like this is what excites me is right now we're planning the future of the kind of cities that I want to live in. The future
Yes.
cities where we're not heavily polluting, where there's more walkways, where it's more public transit. I mean, because we're only going to keep having a huger, bigger influx of people living in cities. Then, of course, there's all these elements of connecting people out further in a regional. There's a lot to talk about, but I want to come to your current company that you started. You say Aviatris, right? Or
The
Aviatris?
beaches. Yep.
Um,
And
which is
actually,
like the French word for female pilot, is it not? Yes,
yeah,
okay. Because
yeah,
I know, yeah, for filmmaker in French, realisatrice. That's a really hard one for me. I can
it
never
is.
really get that one out.
Yeah.
So my friend told me to say a different name. Do you know what another word for filmmaker is in French? It's like cineaste or something like that. I don't know.
Yeah, because and I got a, not, I wouldn't say a pushback, but there was an interest into why I chose, a company name that would, instead of saying aviator or something along the lines of where it doesn't differentiate females and males. And I said, well, because of my French background, it's naturally a name that I've always gravitated to. So it doesn't necessarily mean anything else other than what it's always meant to me.
Yeah, it's just in France, your title is generally gendered, and that's
Exactly.
not something that we
And
experience
that's
in America.
right.
But
And
I
that's the way that language is used. Yeah.
my aunt is a pilot and has been for
Oh,
FedEx for
fantastic.
years, and I really looked up to her, and she's really smart and just so cool. And I still get emotional when I see female pilots like public. And I like recently on my flight to Seattle, it was like female pilot one of the ways out, and I was like, yes, like representation in public aviation is really important to me. And I've talked to like young women who are going into the field, but traditionally it's very white and very male. Let's just
Yeah.
be real.
Mhm.
So thanks for your representation and for like being being an image for other young women to look up to, right? Um,
Yeah, thank
Go
you.
ahead. Yeah. Let's talk about the business. Tell me about what you do and talk, if you're open to it, let's talk about Beverly Regional Airport.
Sure. Yeah, so I started my business consulting and advising. So I actually do a lot of advisory work for startup companies in advanced air mobility. So OEMs, even space. One of the companies I was advising for was recycling in space. That's a very, very small way to put what they actually did. And so I actually got more involved in startups than I had originally intended to, and actually developed some really interesting relationships along the way of doing that. So my company does what's typical for airports, so infrastructure development, looking at, and I partner with some bigger organizations, and we go after innovative projects. So some whether it's a microgrid development on airports, and if that airport or city is looking at how to implement smart technology, AAM, or brought in for me as a community stakeholder engagement. And just because I've worked with so many community groups in the past, and I would say some contentious projects in which you have to have a very broad consensus of approval from all the stakeholders involved. So political parties, the actual city councils, and anyone that's involved in the decision making part, as well as the community themselves. And so there have been some meetings that, and that's taken, that's I've done that since my really one of my first roles in airports and in aviation, going back 15 years ago. So I so that's actually the part that I love, because it's a lot of these airports and city developers are looking at ways on how can we integrate this, how, but it's usually sometimes told from an engineering perspective, where it may not get the idea across as much. Sometimes you can get lost in the technical jargon, which I tried not to go too much into earlier, but maybe. So it's really about the storytelling on how to get, you have a technical report, but how do you get that communicated in a way that's understandable, that people can appreciate, they can see a lot of times. So you invite them in to understand it, and usually in-person setting is really the best. The virtual stakeholder meetings were much more difficult, I would say, when during COVID, because of the so much community involvement, and and so that's where, I really enjoy, I love doing work that involves the community for understanding, because I'm also a community member and also a pilot. So I have varied, I would say, viewpoints when you're discussing a project, particularly with advanced air mobility, where there's a lot of uncertainty. We need a lot more storytelling media around this, because if we're looking at really having the community understand it, in which we are looking at communities and cities to adopt this into their systems, we need an understanding early on and very soon.
I like that you said it's about storytelling.
It is.
So, can you give me an example of how you telling a story helped with one of the airports or companies that you worked with, and how that kind of sped things up?
um yeah, I'll give a previous example and I would say it could be a similar scenario, because the way that vertiports are being designed take a lot of design standards that are similar to how a heliport would operate. So helicopters, are noisy. There's a lot of sometimes there's pushback. The previous airport that I had managed, there was quite a lot of helicopter activity, but the so when you're looking at vertiport design, which would be a part of AAM, you're anticipating some of the same community um, uh, perceptions. And I would say, I'll give an example. One project in the first airport that I had managed, we were about to undergo a huge construction project. Both runways were undergoing construction. It was going to take quite a while, and there was going to be noise, of course. So the community was involved. I was invited into a ward meeting that was televised, and as I was walking in, the producer, one of the producers, took me in, and I said, "What's the climate?" And he goes, "They have pitchforks. They are ready to, to, scream at you, whatever it was." And I got in there, and it was very much that environment. People were yelling. They were quite upset about the project and its potential impacts. And I brought my diagrams with me. I brought some things that could be hands on for the community to see. And by the time I left, I actually had people clapping, coming up to me, shaking my hand, saying thank you. This is a really great project, and thank you so much for being here explaining it. So I think when you have that communication, in let's address this, let's focus on this, even if it's quite difficult, of a conversation. And to build that consensus again is what is really going to be necessary, particularly in this focus of AAM. So I would say taking that same type of understanding of how community dynamics, what is wanted, because I've been in so many of these meetings in which you do have to explain environmental impacts and other impacts that could impact one community more than another community per se.
I think sometimes it just seems like letting the public get it out. I was just at the AI summit and they were talking about, I feel very conflicted about the Boston Dynamics dog spot because it just creeps me out. And like, even during the talk, they were like, yeah, we don't know why it's so creepy. We're working on it. We're really trying to make it less creepy. We actually had bounce in its step because it used to move like completely still like flat, and that was too creepy for the engineers. So they talked about how police were going to use it for things like bomb threats or violent standoffs, where like, to me,
Yeah.
okay, I can't argue with that. Even if the thing creeps me out, it's definitely better for something to go in that's not armed. And the pictures of the public, where that's what I was thinking of. It's like everyone's like big
Yes.
signs. People hate change. Change is
Yeah.
painful. Change is scary. And so yeah, that's definitely not an easy room to walk into. So I'm
Yeah.
impressed by that. Speaking of pitchforks, I really like asking people about their plot twists. So can you tell me about one memorable plot twist in your career and kind of how you've overcome it and how you've kind of started a new chapter?
Yeah. So it's interesting, when I went, my second role, I was my first role out of college, I was an aviation insurance producer. And then I moved to Aspen Airport in Colorado, and that airport was small enough yet large enough to have, they had commercial service, but it was a very interesting community dynamic, and I loved that role. I was in operations when I first started, so I was an aircraft rescue firefighter. So I actually did all of the roles in that airport, because you were all required to do that because it was small enough that you could learn everything. But I remember thinking at the time, I love this job. I could win the lottery and it wouldn't mean anything to me, because I get to work here. I get to work at this like in this amazing environment. Whereas, I would say highly tense as far as the amount of work, what you're doing. The operations are head to head. It's and the airport itself has some particular challenges because it's in a mountainous area and different. And again, that community also had different viewpoints on some of the projects that were going on. And I remember my peers at the time saying like, yeah, we don't want to ever become an airport manager or director. And I just thought like, yeah, that's something I actually really want to do. And so that was a huge change in direction, going from operations and more of a that kind of role into suddenly you're in the newspaper, you have to respond to every type of potential criticism or praise in fact for either projects that were going on. So I had a a good understanding because of my experience kind of working in the public domain and then consulting before I became turned into my first upper management role. But it was just interesting because some people do say they would never want to do it because of the politics involved as far as what it takes and the amount of I would say the pressure.
Yeah. I feel you. Pivoting is hard.
Yeah.
Hmm. Well, let's come back. So like I love that you're able to support a wide swath of different orgs now. I would definitely perked up when you said recycling in space. So I'm really intrigued by that. But when it comes to AIM, you and I have talked about how nice it would be to just show people the difference between how long it takes to drive certain places. Like, and I made a video where the guy talked about, flying over the Great Lakes. He talked about island hopping. That's a really big place. How just what a difference it makes and how much time it saves. What is something just story wise that you wish people knew in the public? If you could wave a magic wand and have everyone just suddenly understand.
Yeah, I think so. There are some really good examples on the companies and cities that have integrated AAM. And, one that I'm thinking of is Beta Technologies in Burlington. Um, it's a destination that's in the mountains. I've flown there a bunch of times in my own plane. Um, but it's really, for me, when I purchased my first aircraft, it's similar in the sense that, um, so I, and this is different because, it's not looking at owning these aircraft particularly, but from when someone would tell me what they would do on the weekend. Oh, I went to the Cape Cod. We sat in 4 hours of traffic one way. We spent all weekend battling the traffic. And I said, oh, that's interesting. I went to I went to that same area, like if it was Provincetown or something, and it took me 17 minutes to get there. I went there for lunch in the beach and then flew back and was here in time for dinner. And then sometimes on the weekends I would be in 3 or 4 states, just for flying for different whatever it was, flying with different missions, I would say, or different activities, go hiking in the afternoon, go back to the beach and at for dinner or something. And so I think when you're looking at some of the uses of course, it's going to use the autonomous vehicles eventually. And to look at the travel, the way that we haven't been able to, I would say, reach a user or potentially demographics of a particular area in other modes of transportation, because right now it's very expensive to fly, conventional aircraft. The overall goal eventually for the vehicles involved in AAM is to have more accessibility. And so that means, of course, whether it's medical transport, getting, goods um, in and out of those areas where, that are harder to reach destinations, again, mountainous islands, etc. So I think when you're looking at that, for the necessary aspects of medical transport, life saving, and then also for personal use, whether it's either personal or business use. So flying your family to, or being able to get your family to other locations, or maybe your locality changes because of it. So I
Yeah.
think it's reaching a different type of audience and user that potentially have not been able to use the aviation system as they would have right now.
Right. No, yeah, it's more. I mean, the Americans have tended to like it was. I remember something like it's like less than half, but like 44% of Americans fly each year. Almost like 90% of Americans have taken at least one flight. But the thing that got me was only 20% of people on Earth have ever flown. Like 80% of human beings on the planet have never been on a plane, and it made me think
Right.
about my friend Masitan who lives in Mali. We were working on getting her visa to come to the US. Her visa didn't get approved, but we're going to get it approved. And that will be the first time she's ever flown.
Mm,
And yeah, to me, it's like flying is such a normal part of my life. But, I think of what you're saying is just access for certain reasons, right? I need to move from
right.
island to island, in Orkney Islands or Hawaii or wherever. Okay, so speaking of this, let's take a bet. What's the most, from your perspective, what is the most outlandish prediction you have for the future of mobility?
Outlandish. So I do think that, what we're seeing now is, you know, so outlandish. That's a good one. I've seen everything as far as my own use for mobility. Like I've used my plane to help me move from one area to another. So I just threw stuff in the back. So I think there's going to be a lot of uses. But I would say, one thing that we're seeing is coming on more and more sustainable aviation fuels. It's a low percentage now, but I think the way that, again, the the way that this has kind of shaken the industry up, in which hasn't really been done before. It's gone over a century in a particular mode, a very safe transportation mode, and I think this is getting companies to, and airports and systems and cities, to think about the innovation in transportation. So typically, when you're planning for capital projects, it takes years and years and years, and that's just not going to work with how we're looking at the start. A lot of these startups, they don't have years and years and years and years of funding. So seeing now some of them changing maybe into hybrid uses, while we get passengers and people, eventually passengers, more comfortable with seeing these vehicles in their communities, and in some of the tests in the communities that they exist now, developing those, making those stronger, getting the demos out, getting it really down to, let's advertise this, let's broadcast this, and let's these are going to be the cities that are going to be the most innovative at first, and then I think people will start following suit.
Yeah, so the outlandish thing is that this industry that has kind of been the same more or less for many
Yes,
years is getting shaken up and
it's
forced to
getting
rethink how they fuel the plane. We might have sustainable fuel we can put in the jets and in the planes, which would be amazing. And then
right.
just like this huge influx of investment in alternative ways to fly and alternative ways to power it is so exciting. But
Absolutely.
the thing I'm going to remember most from this is you throwing rugs and clothes in your plane to move.
Yeah.
That's great. How far were you going? Can I ask?
I wasn't that far. It was probably what would normally take about a 4 or 5 hour drive, and I think in my plane it was maybe like 45 minutes or so.
It's pretty nice. And so, do you
Yeah,
think,
not bad.
if right now it's like the people who do, there are people, individuals that own flying machines or of like eVTOLs, like individual
Yes.
light utility eVTOLs, and they're mostly the super wealthy or actually
Yes.
sometimes farmers, but most of the time it's people with a giant property who want to pick up their mail and go
Right.
across their 2 mile property. But
Right.
do you think in the future middle class families will have access to this and be able to do what you're doing?
Absolutely. And
Um,
when I say that, I mean more for commercial consumption,
hmm
commercial use. So,
Yeah.
not private use where there's a ton of restrictions on that, where you can
Mm,
operate, how you can operate, which airspace you can operate in, but integration in existing airport or in existing systems. So the goal is eventually, urban air mobility, but regional air mobility too. So yes, so for commercial consumption and not just individual use, because that's the scalability for a lot of these, the OEMs, is how to get paying passengers, because you don't want the planes sitting idle. They need to be used, in order to be able to generate income
yeah.
and revenue. Yeah.
Yeah. It makes more sense that way.
Hmm.
And that's a better future for everybody, is more, basically more shared transit and less moving away from the idea of the car that is honestly just sitting there on the street taking up space. I live in Brooklyn, and the cars take up so much of the space that we kind of need.
Right.
And I love my car because it's like a private space in a city, but I'd be happy. I mean, if I use it maybe 2 hours a week, right? Like, it's like I really
Right.
could easily replace that with like a rented thing, or right,
Right.
because American culture is still so entrenched in like my car, my thing, I need
It's,
my plane. Yeah.
yeah, it's very different. Yeah.
Yeah, we're different. But I just want to say this is such a great conversation. So Gloria, thank you so much for coming on. And thank you for listening to Cool People, Cool Tech, Cool Stories. Huge thanks to Gloria Bouillon. And you can check out the show notes for links to Aviatris Advisors website. Let us know what you thought of the episode on social using the hashtag #CoolCoolCool podcast. Gloria, thanks for coming.
Excellent. Thank you so much.